Thank you very much, everybody, and thank you for your warm welcome. Thank you, Dean Stephen, for your kind words. It's a real joy to be with you today, and such a joy to be in Canada. Before we sort of get into the body of the lecture today, I just wanted to give a brief introduction, although Stephen's already given a resounding one. My name is Danny Johnson, as he's covered. As you can see here, if that's changed. Yeah. Great, okay, I've not fallen at the first hurdle, the tech works. This is me with the Archbishop of Canterbury the morning of the coronation, and we're crossing from Lambeth Palace over to Westminster Abbey with the other bishops in attendance at the coronation as well. This photograph, I'm quite pleased. I don't often take a very good photograph, so I'm quite pleased with it anyway. It's just nice to share that with you. But also, this for me epitomises my involvement, and I still pinch myself when I look at this photograph, because I'm stood next to the Archbishop of Canterbury on the morning of the coronation, walking over for him to crown King Charles III. And it's been an extraordinary journey. As Stephen said, I've worked at Lambeth Palace for nearly a decade in a variety of roles. And in April of 2021, I took on what we euphemistically call events of national significance, which is the sort of the planning and the preparation to resource the church and for the church's response for the demise of senior members of the royal family and other notable public figures. So I took on this role in April 2021, and fortunately I'm a bit of a nerd, so I hit the books quite quickly. But within 2 weeks of my taking on the role, very sadly, the late Duke of Edinburgh passed away, which is the photograph from the top left as you're looking at it, which is his funeral. And so within 2 weeks, I was suddenly plummeted into, it was a real baptism of fire, I think would be the appropriate phrase. I remember early on going to a meeting at Buckingham Palace, and as we're walking along the corridor, an equerry said to me, just so you know, when you're talking about royal demise, it's should, not when. If you say when, that's an act of treason, because that implies you know something's going to happen. So I found myself in meetings talking about the 99-year-old Duke of Edinburgh and the 95-year-old sovereign saying, should, and not when. And the other thing that also grew out of this moment, which we weren't strictly prepared for, with only 2 weeks' notice on my part, is what we now lovingly in my family call Operation Black Suit, which was the moment when I was on my Easter holiday and received the phone call to tell me that the Duke of Edinburgh died, where I had to race back to London, ring my next-door neighbour, ask her to break into my flat, to get a black suit out of my wardrobe and put it in a taxi and send it to the office immediately. But you'll be pleased to know I have learnt some things in this job, and I now keep a black suit in my office. After the Duke of Edinburgh's funeral, I then went on to help the Church of England's resourcing for the Platinum Jubilee of Her late Majesty, as well as the service of Thanksgiving that was held at St Paul's Cathedral. And then, very sadly, just less than 6 months later, we then activated what we called Operation London Bridge, which was the code name for the late Queen's funeral, which you'll see again on the bottom left-hand corner. And this was the most extraordinary experience. It was, and it's almost impolite to say, electric. These 10 days where suddenly the work that we'd been doing, the planning and the resourcing, was the centre of international focus, and something that's really stayed with me. And from that moment, then 10 days later, the Archbishop came to me and said, we'd like you to take on as our person who sort of looks after the logistics and the planning for the coronation. Again, fortunately, being a bit of a nerd, I then spent my holiday in Egypt reading about English coronations. So here's a couple of the photographs from the rehearsals of the coronation. So part of my job as the coronation planning director was I, on behalf of the Archbishop, administrated the committees that he led and he chaired, which drew up the liturgy and the order of service, and then we put it into rehearsals. We practiced it 3 to 4 times a week at Lambeth Palace with the Archbishop and his staff, which I have to say were some of the greatest joys of the time that I worked at Lambeth, us all rehearsing it together over lunch. And then we began the ceremonial rehearsals at Buckingham Palace and then later at Westminster Abbey. So as you can see on these photographs, the large photograph on the left is me with His Majesty the King, What you can't really see there, but we'll come to later, is I'm holding the scepter for him. We're doing in the instructions of how this gets handed over. The other two are the fixed look of anxiety that I had for the 8 months of planning the coronation. But with the time I've got with you this evening, so being a bit of a nerd, I did a huge amount of research. And so what I want to share with you contextually within the sort of prism of the King's coronation in 2023 is some of the things I learned of where these customs and traditions and sort of the strange eccentricities and idiosyncrasies of coronation came from. Excuse me just one second. But we're going to start that with what I'm calling a Canadian caveat, which is a Canadian-based apology. This talk is unashamedly English. I thought it would be a real nerve to come to Canada for the first time and tell you about your relationship as a church and as a people with the sovereign. That's something that I look forward to hearing about during the Q&A and afterwards. All I knew when arriving in Canada 4 days ago is that you're famously polite and your view of Niagara Falls is better than the Americans. So it didn't feel appropriate to try and tell you how the theology of an English coronation may or may not fit with Canadian theology. And so I hope there will be some of these things that you feel aligned with, or some of these things that feel in common to your own beliefs. If not, or should it not, then I hope that it will promote thought and maybe some discussion afterwards. And it may, if nothing else, provide you with an insight of an English perspective on a coronation. So we're going to jump straight in. So 2023 was the coronation of His Majesty King Charles III. Before that, the previous coronation was in 1953, 70 years before. And although some of us may remember that coronation, they are images that are consigned to memory and to nostalgia. And we all hold a memory of the 1953 coronation, whether we were there or not, or we've seen it in photographs and on film. And for many of us, I suspect, those images feel enormously removed from the United Kingdom and from the Canada of 2023. So one of the big challenges we had when preparing the coronation was to really dig into these images and these symbols and to understand what it is that we're trying to say, both about the king and about the coronation. This picture here that you see on the slide is from the very first English coronation, which is the coronation of King Edgar, which was in 973. In 973, the Archbishop of Canterbury was St Dunstan, and it took place in Bath Abbey. But this coronation set a pattern and a mould that we still observe nearly 1,000 years later. And if you consider, during this moment, this is before Parliament, this is before a constitutional settlement, our understanding today of what a constitutional monarchy is. It was a private ceremony. If we're being honest, it was usually a bit of a rush job, where we didn't have state occasions and ceremonial in 973. You had to get the crown on the next person as quickly as you can because you might have your land stolen. And so this was done very quickly, privately, always set within a Eucharist and a religious service, and then there would be a public proclamation afterwards where the king would be lifted onto the arms of nobles so he could be paraded around for you all to see and enjoy his image. But the format and that model has stayed with us all this time. We then come, you'd be pleased to know we're doing this in quite big chunks, we're then coming to 1377, which is the coronation of Richard II. And this was the first coronation where the concept of visual storytelling and symbolism really started to come into play. Richard II, when he acceded the throne, was 10 years of age. And so the British court faced a problem, which is how do we suggest and how do we demonstrate the king's authority and power when he's only 10 years old and his physical presence isn't enough? So for his coronation, they produced this vast pageant and this spectacle to demonstrate his power and his rightful place. And since then, spectacle and visual storytelling and sort of motifs and symbolism have played such an important part of telling us about what a coronation is. If you like, it's a little bit like a sales pitch. So whenever you go and buy a new car, you know, the salesman will tell you what it's going to be like to drive before you've driven it. And that's very much what a coronation's like. The coronation itself is the sales pitch to tell you what life under this reign and what this sovereign is going to give us, the people. And it forms a really important part of defining the age we're about to live in. And what we've seen since this point is the theology of modern monarchy has changed. Obviously in 973 and in 1377 and right the way up to the British Civil War, there was a sense of the divine right of kings, that these were God's chosen people. And obviously that is a theology we've moved far away from now. And certainly over the last 70 years, and the example that the late Queen Elizabeth II set is that the royal family are there to serve, not to be served. They are the principal public servants of this nation and every nation to which they are fortunate to be head of state. And so that was a really important thing to capture in the coronation. And so as we explored how to update the coronation for the first time, we had to understand the customs and the traditions, as I've said, and which statements we should keep and which ones would emphasise this new Carolean age. What is it that the king wants to be defined as during this time? And it's extraordinary. We live in the most educated time in any of our histories. We are the most connected we've ever been, and we are the best resourced we've ever been. But one thing that has not changed from 1377 to 2023 is that pictures still mean more than words. And a picture paints 1,000, is that the correct phrase? Picture tells 1,000 words, something like that. Tells a lot of words. So it was really important when devising the whole rubric for the coronation that this sits within creating images and pictures that tell a story and seek to inform us about the reign of the king. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to just take you through 3 or 4 of the key elements that I believe tell the story of the coronation and what the message of the coronation is and what we're trying to get across. So what we have here is the king's arrival at the abbey, and he is in long red robes, which we call the robes of state. And you have to imagine at this point, the tradition from this comes from pre-television, before most of us, the general public, were able to get inside the abbey visually to see what was happening. So the statement of the sovereign's arrival into the abbey, for the public outside, would have been the last time they see them before their exit again. So there's a big emphasis and demonstration on presentation going in and coming out of the abbey. And so, as you'll see here, the colour is notable. So these long red crimson robes are the robes of state, as I've said, and these are historically considered to be a noble colour. It's an expensive colour to create, and the reason it's so expensive is to get this dye, you have to, here we are, so it comes from kermes beetles, which are tiny little red beetles that live in the leaves of a certain type of Mediterranean oak tree called Quercus cocoifera. And so these are absolutely tiny. So to make even the smallest swatch of fabric, you need tens of thousands of them. So this is incredibly labour intensive. And the whole robe, I'll just go back a second, so you can see that the whole robe is 18 feet, 4.5 inches, and so that's 5.6 metres for those in metric. And so it's the most extraordinary garment. And this one, in fact, was actually the king's grandfather, George VI, which he had made in 1937. And here it is undergoing restoration ahead of the coronation. And it's the most extraordinary garment, but it really is a symbol of the king going in defined as a king. He's noble, he's of high social status, but key is he is not yet anointed king. And as we go through this talk, you'll see that changes. And here we see the king as he arrives in the abbey. And can you see, I don't know how well you can see it on the, in the pictures, the chain he's wearing from shoulder to shoulder. There's a sort of long gold chain that hangs down. Actually, there we are, so you can see it there. So that chain, so that's what's called the collar and badge of the Noble Order of the Garter, which is the United Kingdom's oldest and most senior rank of chivalry, which was founded in a date I've lost at the moment, but we'll come back to, don't worry. 1348, I found it. And it is exclusive to the Sovereign, the Prince of Wales, and 24 other members. You can only have 26 people at a time in the Noble Order of the Garter. And then hanging from that, you can see the large image blown up for you, which is called the Great St. George. So this is the badge that's worn. which was commissioned by Charles II in 1661. It's made of enamel and has 20 large diamonds, and according to the description given to me by the Royal Archive, 20 large diamonds and 100 and odd lesser diamonds. What it is to be a lesser diamond. And so it's the most extraordinary thing. And again, one of the things we had to learn is why would the sovereign come in wearing this? Why have the sovereigns come in wearing this badge? And it's to understand that is the beginning of the religious aspect of this service. The sovereign, the king in this case, is coming to the abbey about to humble themselves before God, to be anointed, and only after which can they then be crowned as sovereign. And so the whole idea of the inward procession is not an opportunity, as lovely as it is for us all, to have a good gawp and see how nice the king looks today. The whole aspect of it, it's about pilgrimage. This is a long journey in which he undertakes. And the tradition of the garter chain and the badge comes from enculpions, which are the sort of icons worn by Eastern Orthodox bishops, which were tradition started in the Byzantine period. But in this sense, it's a little bit like how many of us may choose to wear a St. Christopher when travelling. It is a demonstration and an interceding and calling upon that saint to be with them. And obviously, notably, it's St. George, which is the patron saint of England, which is why it's their badge that gets worn on this day. But as you see, the king coming through the abbey on this long journey. And these robes, as I said, are robes of state, which are, after the coronation, the sovereign then continues to wear annually for the state opening of Parliament, which is where our Houses of Parliament are opened and a new session of government is started. So in effect, this is to coin a phrase, this is the king's work uniform. You know, this is what he wears to the office. This is what he reigns in. And so what we were about to see is when he will become divested of these robes, what a powerful symbol that makes. But the king remains in these robes throughout the legally necessary parts of the service. So the recognition where the king is presented to all four sides of the abbey to gain their consent of his likeness, as well as the coronation oath, which he subscribes to in the abbey and is delivered by the Archbishop of Canterbury, are the two legally and constitutionally necessary bits of the coronation. They're held within the UK's national legislature and have been since the co-coronation of William and Mary in 16... I'm not going to try and guess it. We'll Google it at the end. But going back to the storytelling, the king arrives with us, sort of noble, regal, sure of his position, but not yet quite set apart to fulfill a vocation and a purpose that he's been called to. So we then come to the anointing, where the king is divested of the robes of state and all his adornments. And he's brought to just a white shirt, and this demonstrates a simplicity. It's deliberately chosen for its simplicity and to evoke a sense of a baptismal gown, someone who is about to be anointed and changed, renewed and come afresh. You know, in the same way that Christ, the origins of the word Christ is anointed one, and we as Christians are little anointed ones. The king comes before us to be anointed, to start afresh and to begin a new purpose. But what's interesting, and this is a shot taken from the television, which, because I've failed to find sufficiently good photograph of the king in the shirt, because you miss all the beautiful detail in the shirt. So when commissioning the shirt, the collar and the cuffs were specially designed. So it's made by a company called Turnbull and Asser, who are the best shirt makers in London. And I don't say that as product placement, but if they'd like to send me some shirts, they can. Gratefully received. But the oak tree pattern, the oak leaf pattern and the acorns around the collar and cuffs, it's obviously the national tree of England, so a symbol of Englishness, but also of strength and endurance. And it's been the tree and the sort of symbol of the United Kingdom florally, or fauna rather than flora, since the 16th century. Interestingly, in one of Shakespeare's plays, in Coriolanus, much is made of the fact that the protagonist enters crowned in an oaken garland instead of a crown of laurel leaves. And so this is a very English interpretation of the laurel leaf, which comes from ancient Greece and then ancient Rome, as a symbol of victory and of authority and status. And it's, in terms of victory, it's still a symbol that we see in military uniforms, both in the United Kingdom and here in Canada. If you look on the peak of the cap, this is called an oak leaf sprig, which colloquially in the United Kingdom, and maybe it's the same here in Canada, we would call scrambled egg. Which is this oak pattern that runs around senior military officials' headwear. But most notably in England, the oak's place in our history was sort of most striking as the hiding place of Charles II, where he hid from parliamentarians during the Civil War, and that during the Battle of Worcester in 1651. And that really cemented the tree's place in our national history. But interestingly, it's not just our history that holds the place of the oak tree. In Hebrew tradition, as well as in the Bible, much is made of oak trees. The oak tree at Shechem, is the site where Jacob buries the foreign gods for his people in Genesis 35. And Joshua erects a stone under an oak tree as the first covenant of the God of Israel in Joshua 24. But for me, most significantly, and of greatest inspiration during the coronation, is Isaiah 61. And I'm going to read it, otherwise I'm going to get this wrong if I try to recall it. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives and to release from darkness the prisoners, to comfort all who mourn and provide for those who grieve, to bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of gladness instead of mourning, and a garment of praise instead of the spirit of despair. The prophet then continues to refer to the Israelites as oaks of righteousness. Now, please don't for 1 minute think that you've come to a talk where someone from the United Kingdom is suggesting that His Majesty King Charles III is the prophecy of which Isaiah speaks. I'm not here to tell you that. Instead, I reflect more that the prophecy that Isaiah teaches us is to tell us of what it is to be a Christian leader, and particularly a Christian leader in 2023. And His Majesty the King starts his coronation. He is charting a new course of what it is to be a sovereign and a Christian leader in this day and age. And the King is about to commit himself and is about to reflect in the details of the iconography that you'll see and throughout the service how he is going to do this and what these promises are that he's about to undertake. So today, both the oak leaf and the colour derived from it remain symbols of history and tradition and victory and triumph in the United Kingdom. As the King is divested and undergoes anointing in a baptismal gown, a deliberate humbling before God, with just a pattern of this righteous symbol on the collar and cuffs. We watched this moment for the first time. And for me, certainly, it was a very powerful moment. I don't know who else in the room saw the coronation on the television. The simplicity of it and the humbling of it as this man who's come in robes and gold, suddenly the screen is removed and he's there on his knees in just a simple white shirt, awaiting God's grace and blessing. And for me, because I'm also a sentimentalist, I recall the proverb, mighty oaks grow from little acorns, which itself dates from the 14th century from Chaucer's Troilus and Cressida. But in particular, I think of this image of the then Prince Charles watching his mother's anointing in 1953. And if you'll excuse the romanticism on my part, we then see that come full circle. That small acorn of a young prince has then grown and is now here to anchor the nation and all of those nations to which he is called to be head of state, and has grown into this oak of righteousness to strengthen and to deliver and to protect, and demonstrating the shared promise of Isaiah's prophecy. We then come to the oil itself. So a huge amount of research was done with the oil. The oil, for those who don't know, has been an ancient recipe for hundreds of years. It's been passed successively from generation to generation. One of the difficulties we found in 2023 is it had a huge number of animal byproducts in it that aren't commonly found animal byproducts. I say that, sorry. Certainly in London, we don't have a huge number of wild civet cats. Maybe in Toronto you do. Don't make assumptions. And maybe a raccoon's gland isn't going to quite work in the same way for us. As well as products from whales and other animals that it would not be appropriate to try and harvest for this occasion. So one of the great joys for me was going to the archives at Westminster Abbey and looking at this original recipe, which has then been successively modified and changed over time, but harks true to the original recipe still, and looking at all the separate ingredients, and then from there progressing the research again to understand what the sort of not only fragrant properties of these ingredients are, but also what the spiritual and symbolic properties of the oil are. So here is the recipe. And then, so what we ended up with was removing the animal products and producing an oil using olive oil as its basis, and the olive oil was harvested from the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem. And then we included sesame for immortality, rose for compassion, orange for good fortune, jasmine for modesty and humility, cinnamon for prosperity and a reminder of the avoidance of sin, as we see in Proverbs 7, benzoin for purification, amber for protection, and neroli for virtue. These oils were then combined and co-consecrated in Jerusalem by his most godly beatitude, Patriarch Theophilus III, who's the man directly in the centre there, and to his left, or onto the right as you see it on screen, the Anglican Archbishop in Jerusalem, Archbishop Hossam. And this was an amazing moment. The consecration took place in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is the 4th century church in Jerusalem, which contained within are considered to be two of the most holy sites in Christianity, being Calvary, where Christ was crucified, and his tomb of the Holy Sepulchre. So this was an incredible moment, and one that really demonstrated the Christian nature and the Christian heritage of a coronation and what it calls to us. And I believe it sort of further enhanced the spiritual nature of this act, with the strong links between the coronation, the Old Testament, and the Holy Land, as we chart all the way back to King Saul, and as we hear about in the amazing coronation anthem of Zadok the priest. Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet anointed Solomon as king. On top of which, there's also an incredibly personal element to it, which is that the Mount of Olives is the burial place of the king's paternal grandmother, Princess Alice of Battenberg. So to know that this olive oil came and represented both his paternal side as well as his heritage on his maternal side was an incredibly important moment. Then we come to the ampulla. So the ampulla is a slightly odd coronation idiosyncrasy. So this is the gold eagle-shaped jug from which the oil is held and then poured for the Archbishop of Canterbury to anoint the sovereign. So it's got the head, as you see it, is removable, where you pour the oil in, and then the oil will then get poured out of the beak of this sort of gold eagle with its wings outstretched. The history of the eagle comes from the 14th century, and it is said that Thomas à Becket, then Archbishop of Canterbury, had a vision where the Virgin Mary appeared to him and presented him with a golden eagle to hold the oil for the purpose of consecrating future sovereigns. Safe to say, slightly odd in 21st century context, probably just as odd in 12th century context, to have a golden eagle presented to you. But it is one that has then continued through our history. This particular eagle was recreated during the Restoration period. The original was melted down during the Civil War, and this new one was created in 1661. But interestingly, with the eagle, there are two schools of thought. The first is as to why it's an eagle, I should say. There are two schools of thought. The first is derived from the belief that eagles were capable of staring at the sun, and that we as Christians are able to gaze unflinchingly at the revelation of the divine word. The second being that the eagle is believed to be the bird that flew closest to the sun, and therefore closest to heaven, and symbolises the carrying of the divine word to the four corners of the world. It is for this reason, as well as its iconography based on St. John, as you often see, St. John is represented either as an eagle or with an eagle. You can see here in the stained glass window on the left, because his writing is said to most clearly witness the light and divinity of Christ. For these reasons, it is an eagle who brings this good news, and the good news in terms of the oil, but also to us as Christians, which is why, and I was thrilled to see, St. James also has an eagle-shaped lectern and why you see so many eagle-shaped lecterns in churches all over the world. Coronation spoon. Again, something delightfully British about a coronation spoon. But it's in fact the oldest piece of the coronation regalia. It's the only surviving piece from the Middle Ages that wasn't melted down during the Civil War. And it's just the most extraordinary object. And you just hold for a moment that picture in your mind and think this has been used at every coronation since 973. This has been held by St Dunstan, St Thomas a Becket, and has anointed every British sovereign right up to present day. It's the most extraordinary lineage and heritage as an object. We then come to the stole. So the stole is an item that has been historically used, but for the 2023 coronation, we created a new one. It was commissioned through the Worshipful Company of Girdlers, which is a London livery company, which is an ancient, how do I explain a livery company? A sort of ancient guild. Thank you, this lady in the front. I'm going to ask her up to give a précis talk on worshipful companies. They're a guild of tradespeople, and so girdlers are iron workers. They very kindly paid for this new stole, which was designed at the Royal College of Arms and then produced by the Royal School of Needlework. What I love about the stole is it really looks into the iconography of the coronation. So you can see on the left, this is a mock-up of it sitting on a dummy that was made out of paper for us to see. And in the centre there we have the emblems of the 4 nations of the United Kingdom. So the leek for Wales, shamrock for Ireland, the thistle for Scotland, and the rose for England. And the thing I love most, you see in the far bottom right corner, is this blown up section, which comes from the nape of the neck, which is the gridirons with the palm leaves over the top. And what's lovely about it is, so the gridirons are a symbol of St Lawrence and his martyrdom, who is also the patron saint of the Girdlers Company. But the palm leaves are the things I love the most. So the palm leaves are the ancient symbol of martyrdom, but also an ancient symbol of passing of knowledge from one person to another. If you look in medieval Christian artwork, often saints are portrayed holding or passing a palm leaf to one another, as well as, of course, the palm leaves that foretell Jesus' arrival that are laid before him. And it's just the most wonderful thing, all this rich symbolism woven into an ecclesiastical garment worn by the sovereign. And in particular, another innovation, which was the presentation of the stole by the Prince of Wales. Again, harking on this lineage of that the king is being passed the knowledge of his mother, and he's being invested with that symbolically by his son, who he will one day pass it to. Then towards the end of the investiture, the king is presented with the rod and the sceptre. So starting with the sovereign sceptre with the dove here, which is also called the rod of equity and mercy. And it is a demonstration of the sovereign's spiritual authority and what they are called to do pastorally and the pastoral care for their people. And you can see it sort of larger photographs of it on the right-hand side there. We then come to the sovereign's sceptre with the cross, which is a demonstration of the sovereign's temporal powers and his authority. And in the centre of it is what's called the Cullinan II diamond, which you can see in the larger photograph, which is what's called the Star of Africa. And this is the larger, it was cut into, I think, 6 pieces or 8 pieces, the largest of which sits inside the sceptre. But what's interesting, you'll see here, is the king is holding the sceptre in his right hand, but wearing a glove, this glove, in fact. And that is, again, is a visual demonstration. The king is presented with a glove and wears a glove only on one hand, both because in the medieval period, if one was challenging one to a duel or into battle, you would cast down your gauntlet as a symbol of challenge. And this harks to the king being an advocate for us, to be our challenger, but also talks about holding authority lightly and softly in a gloved hand. So we see the king here holding these 2 instruments of office, one of temporal and spiritual authority, and the other one of spiritual authority and one of temporal authority. And it's quite a striking moment. We then come to, obviously, what is my favourite moment of the coronation. And not just my favourite moment, because I made the Archbishop and Jackie here practice it 4 times a week for 8 months. But for me, the crowning of the sovereign is obviously the most significant moment. This is the outward symbol and the demonstration to all of us of what has happened behind the anointing screen that has been shielded from us. It's a public act and a demonstration. So the crown in which the Archbishop of Canterbury uses to crown the sovereign is called St Edward's crown, and this was commissioned in 1661. The original was destroyed in 1649 during the Civil War. Charles II commissioned Robert Viner, who was the royal jeweller at the time, to design the crown, and the crown was to hold a shape and form that was close to its original, and it confers in its presentation to the king. It confirms in authority the passing of, confirms in joy rather, the passing of authority from one sovereign to another. And it's the only crown that's still worn by a sovereign in the Western Hemisphere. Most other monarchies that still exist in Europe and beyond don't tend to wear their crown jewels anymore, so that makes it even more important in my opinion. So, very quickly, here you have the front and the back. Quick competition time, ladies and gents. Who thinks the front is the left-hand image? Hands up. Okay. Okay, what about four or five? And so then the one on the right-hand side. So everyone's saying the right-hand side. So the 5 of you who said the left-hand side, congratulations, you can submit an application to be the next Archbishop of Canterbury. Well done. So the left is the front. And there are very few ways. There's only 3 ways in which you can tell the front and the back of the crown, which is why it required such careful rehearsing. But a lot of the original details are exactly as they were for the previous crown that was destroyed in 1649. It's made of solid gold and has over 400 stones encrusted into it. Of note, of course, is the purple velvet cap inside. And we'll come on to this later in the talk, but purple is the colour of being anointed. So it's not red like the robes the king wore on the way in, it's now purple because he has been anointed. So the cross pate, which are the small crosses that you see towards the base of the crown, these are obviously undeniably a Christian symbol, and they hark back in our heritage as far as the Lindo Gospels, which are the 9th century, and from the Cross of Canterbury as well. Then you also have the fleur-de-lis that intersect it as they go round, which is originally a French motif and has French origins, but is really important representative iconography and used a lot in heraldry and then later in European art of the Renaissance period to depict either the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, or the Holy Family, Jesus, the Virgin Mary, and St. Joseph. And so again, undeniably Christian in its origins and meaning. And it's difficult to know in the inclusion of these symbols if Charles II was trying to hark back to a previous time or trying to demonstrate a link between church and state by including it in the crown that he would wear as the head of state. But interestingly, on the top, the bits that hold the crown in, which are called half arches and that meet in the centre, and the fact that the mond, which we'll come on to, is slightly dipped down, there's a school of thought that would suggest that this is the church being enveloped by the state, that this is a demonstration, a physical demonstration of the unique relationship between the church and the state in the United Kingdom as an established church. Very quickly, we're just going to talk about consorts' crowns. A bit more jewellery for you all. It's a jewellery-heavy chat, I'm afraid. So traditionally, the sovereign's consort would have a crown made for them. This started right the way back with Queen Mary of Modena in 1685 and has continued through our history. In the 20th century, we had Queen Alexandra in 1902, Queen Mary in 1911, and then Queen Elizabeth, later the Queen Mother, in 1937. So what is interesting for me about these particular crowns is, rightfully so, Her Majesty Queen Camilla chose to reuse a crown for her coronation. That sort of spending is not appropriate in the current climate in the world that we live in today. However, she chose to have Queen Mary's crown of 1911, but modified to have 4 of its half arches removed. And I would suggest in Canada, outside Europe, and away from political Brexit-based discussions, that this is a demonstration of making that crown more English. Queen Alexandra and Queen Mary were both European sovereigns who married the British sovereign. Queen Alexandra was from Scandinavia, Queen Mary was from Germany, and so was extraordinary. And then the Queen Mother, being Scottish, had a 4 half-arched crown. So I would suggest, jokingly, sort of, that this is a demonstration of making this coronation more English, harking back to its original roots by removing any extraneous European influence. Take from that what you will, ladies and gents. But returning to the crown, being the most important thing. We then, if we zoom in slightly, you'll see so each of the 400 stones are held on with an enamel cast around them. This is a red and white enamel cast of an acanthus leaf and the pattern that stretches all the way around. And this is a sort of vegetal motif that's used a lot and has origins right the way back into ancient Egypt. But it is a symbol of immortality and resurrection. So again, motifs and symbols that are undeniably Christian in their meaning. Then we come to the top of the crown, which, and in a francophone country, I don't need to tell you what a monde is. So the little globe on the top, which then has a cross pate on the top of it. This is a sort of small replica of the orb that the king holds at an earlier point of the coronation. But for me, the cross pate on the top is the most image-rich part of the whole crown, and for me is the sort of Rosetta Stone for unlocking the Christian symbolism of the coronation. But firstly, you see there's gold beads on the left and the right. So until 1911, these were pearls that used to hang either side of the crown. And George V in 1911 had those pearls removed. They were originally pearls that belonged to Elizabeth I, and he had them made into 2 earrings for Queen Mary to match the Cambridge Lover's Knot tiara, which you see her pictured in there. But going back to the cross pate on the top, the front being on the left, the back being on the right, you'll see 4 large stones in each of the 4 branches of the cross pate. On the left-hand side, you have 2 diamonds and 2 rubies. The diamonds symbolising strength and health, and the rubies symbolising protection. On the back, you then have 2 diamonds, a ruby, and a peridot, which is the small green stone on the right-hand side of the branch, which symbolises prosperity and balance. But focusing on the front for a moment, there's a school of thought that each of the stones in the cross pate has a symbolic meaning and has not been chosen accidentally, both in its construction and in their use. So the school of thought is that the 4 larger stones in the branches, the 2 diamonds and the 2 rubies, represent the 4 virtues: justice, fortitude, prudence, and temperance, being the 4 characteristics of the virtue theory of ethics, central in Christian philosophy and theology. The smaller stones that are then closest to the large, in the far corners of each of the branches, demonstrate the 8 Beatitudes of Jesus as delivered during his Sermon on the Mount that we hear in Matthew's Gospel and in Luke's. So each of these demonstrates a different beatitude. Blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are those who mourn, blessed are the meek, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. And it is a demonstration of what we as Christians are called to be, and in doing so, how we follow Christ. The crown itself was commissioned in 1661, and contrary to the sort of folkloric belief, this crown has only been worn 7 times in total. It is only used for your coronation, and you don't wear it again during your reign. So this has been worn by Charles II, James II, William III, George V, George VI, Elizabeth II, and Charles III. All the others opted to have a different crown or to have the crown carried before them but not actually wear it. But in a scene that we've all seen in pictures and in paintings, on television, in films, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the primate of all England, slowly delivers the crown upon the sovereign's head. And it's a physical symbol of that anointing that we've not seen, that was shielded away from us. But it's interesting because the king officially became king when he acceded the throne in September 22. But it's only now that he has undergone anointing may he finally, for the first time, receive the crown. Uneasy lies the head that wears the crown is a line from Shakespeare's Henry IV, and it's often misquoted as heavy is the head that wears the crown. But I would argue in the case of St. Edward's crown and the coronation, heavy is the head that wears the crown. Not just in its physical weight at nearly It's 2.23 kilograms, which is nearly 5 pounds, but also heavy in its metaphoric weight. It is the weight of good governance, of Christian values, and an example of loving service that we are all called to through Jesus Christ. It is delivered, and as it is delivered on him, the weight of the expectations of we the people are delivered upon him. In accepting the crown, he accepts a role that is upheld by public consent, that he will be the one to comfort us when we mourn, to be the peacemaker, and to sustain us in our hunger and thirst for righteousness. These are the oaths and the promises the king makes to us, his people. And for me, this is never more true than in the third verse of the national anthem, which itself is a form of prayer, God Save the King, where we sing, "May he defend our laws and forever give us cause to sing with heart and voice, God Save the King." And that, for me, symbolises exactly what the coronation is all about. It's the acceptance of these Christian promises and what the king will do with them. I'm then going to skip ahead because there's not enough time to take you through the coronation step by step. So we're actually then going to cut to his exit from the abbey, which, again, going back to what I said at the beginning, is one of the most important moments for me because it demonstrates a change. So the king and the queen, after communion, leave. They go to St. Edward's Shrine for effectively a costume change. Although we wouldn't call it that. Complete with, you'll see the badge on the king's chain has changed, and this is what's called the Lesser St. George. I'm not quite sure there's anything lesser about it, but lesser nonetheless. But how many people, when they watched the coronation, noticed the change? Did you notice he came out with a different crown on and in a different outfit? So lots of people asked why, because this feels like an unnecessary bit of logistics. But that harks back to the origins of St. Edward's crown, which is the one on the left, and the king leaves wearing what's called the imperial state crown, which is the one on the right. So the origins of St. Edward's crown, the original crown that was destroyed during the Civil War, belonged to St. Edward, formerly King Edward, and was commissioned by him. Therefore, when he died and he was canonised and made St. Edward the Confessor, his crown became a holy relic. It was his property and therefore forbidden from leaving Westminster Abbey. So how are you as a sovereign going to wear that crown almost up to the door when the dean stops you and says, "I'll have that back, thanks very much"? So they had to find another solution, which was to make what they call the imperial state crown. And so this is the crown that makes up part of the king's sort of work uniform. It's the one he wears to the state opening of Parliament, along with the red robes of state that we've seen. The first imperial state crown was made by Charles II, but since then, extraordinarily, 10 further crowns have been made, including one for Queen Victoria in 1838. This crown then did very well until it was dropped by the Duke of Argyll at the state opening of Parliament, where it incurred what was then £150 worth of damage, which I did the sums this morning, which is around 30,000 Canadian dollars worth of damage, which I think is a bit of a bargain for damaging that kind of jewellery. But it was then further changed again to make space for the Cullinan II diamond, its counterpart from the sceptre, which was added in 1909. In 1937, George VI took Queen Victoria's imperial state crown, removed all the jewels and made what he declared a faithful copy in order to better fit him. So here we see a line of succession from Queen Victoria around to Charles III, each in the imperial state crown. The imperial state crown itself, look, I've labelled this one for you. It's not quite the same sort of competition. Weighs an extraordinary 1.6 kilograms, which is nearly 2.5 pounds, and has 2,868 diamonds, 273 pearls, 17 sapphires, 11 emerald, and 5 rubies. It is both a symbolic and a literal demonstration of the history of the line of succession of the British crown. In the centre is the Black Prince's spinel of 1367. Edward, then Prince of Wales, demanded it from the Arab king of Granada, and was later worn by Henry V in 1415 in his helmet at the Battle of Agincourt. Then on the back you see the Stuart sapphire, which was taken into exile by James II, and then later returned by his grandson, the Cardinal Duke of York, who used to wear it in his mitre. So a little tip there for bishops in the room. The sapphire originally was on the front, and then it was made space for the Cullinan II diamond, which you see under the ruby. And then at the very top, in the cross pate, at the very top, is St. Edward's sapphire from 1042, which was from the sapphire ring worn by King Edward, later Edward the Confessor. But as you see, as we get a bit closer, the half arches of this crown are shaped in diamonds and rubies to look like oaken branches. So again, we see this motif of oak and oak leaves coming back into the coronation again and again. And it's woven into the identity of the coronation. And you see beneath the mond are 4 large dangling pearls. And these are brilliant because these pearls belong to Catherine de' Medici, who then gave them to her daughter-in-law, Mary, Queen of Scots, who then, we're going to say, surrendered them to Elizabeth I. I'm not sure you get much choice when you're executed by your cousin, but she surrendered them. But returning to this thought of visual storytelling, the exit is really important because it demonstrates everything that has just gone on. It's a visual demonstration of what's just happened, both with the purple cap inside the crown and the purple robes that the sovereign wears. Purple is the colour, it's an imperial colour, the colour of anointing. So the imperial robe, or the robe of estate as it's also called, weighs 6.8 kilograms, which is 15 pounds, and runs 6.5 metres, which is 21 feet. It's made of purple silk with Canadian ermine trim, you'll be pleased to know, and it took 12 seamstresses 3,500 continuous hours to produce. So they had a sort of sitting circle around it, and when your shift was up, you got out of the chair and somebody came straight back in and picked up from where you left off. It's an extraordinary feat. This particular picture is of the late Queen Elizabeth II's robe, and again, part of what's important is the iconography that surrounds it. So here with the late Queen Elizabeth, it's got ears of wheat all the way around, which meet in her cipher at the bottom, which is really important because the wheat is a symbol of peace and of plenty, which was really important in 1953 when you consider it was still rationing Britain, it was post-war. These were the promises the late Queen was making to her people in her coronation for peace and for plenty. So rather wonderful then with Queen Camilla's robe of estate that hers had floral motifs and really harked to the environmental causes close to the King and Queen's heart. And this was also the first coronation robe that's ever featured insects. There's butterflies, there are bees, and all sorts of really lovely details, including the lily of the valley, which is a nod to the late Queen, which she had in her wedding bouquet. But I'm sure by this point, long way into this lecture, it's not a surprise for any of you that even this colour is prescribed. So this particular shade is called Tyrian purple. And yet again, because I'm a bit of a nerd and I don't have enough things to do with my weekends, I spent a whole Sunday researching Tyrian purple. Why is it this specific shade of purple? And for me, the answer was fascinating. It has a long association in antiquity. It has connotations with the regal and the luxurious. And what's extraordinary about it is it's made in the most malodorous way possible. It's made from snails, ladies and gents. Absolutely disgusting. But it is hundreds of thousands of dehydrated mollusks that get boiled and dried to make a small swatch of fabric. That's what's so glamorous about a royal robe, ladies and gentlemen, dead snails. But unlike other dyes, what's brilliant about Tyrian purple is with age, that colour doesn't fade. It actually becomes deeper and more luxurious, which is why it became so sought after and eventually exclusively worn by priests and kings and emperors. But its origins date all the way back to ancient Greece. And in ancient Greece, the wearing of purple was really tightly legislated. The higher your social rank, or the more important you were, the more purple you could clad yourself in. And there's a story from the Roman historian Suetonius who tells of the king of Mauritania going to see the emperor Caligula, and he clad himself head to toe in purple, which Caligula took as an act of imperial aggression and had him killed. So warning to visiting bishops in the room. But the origin of the colour, it was one that, as the colour developed, it was exclusively worn, but its manufacturing did not suit its story or its provenance for being an item worn of luxury. And so from it, a sort of myth began to emerge around it, which is that the colour was founded by Heracles or Hercules in Roman mythology and by his dog. So there's a lovely painting here by Peter Paul Rubens of Heracles' dog discovering the sea snail from which Tyrian purple was created. And it's somewhat whimsical that this sort of demigod founded the colour purple, but it was a story that nevertheless corroborated what those senior and powerful people wanted it to say, that a demigod has given us this colour. We are important as a consequence. And the provenance still sticks to this day. It's what Kelly Grosvenor describes as a rancid dog's dinner of a hue. But it has become incongruous and symbolic of enduring majesty and power. The origins of Tyrian purple and of Heracles' discovery come from Tyre, which is now in modern-day Lebanon. And it was a city in a province called Phoenicia, which literally means purple land. But for me, interestingly, the word Tyrian purple from Tyre is the origins of the word tyrant. Now, I can feel an intake of breath in the room, don't worry. So it is the origins of the word tyrant, or tyrannical, being of Tyre. But I'm not for 1 minute calling His Majesty the King a tyrant, particularly as this talk is being recorded. That's the sort of chat that would get me into the Tower of London for a long stay. But it's fascinating how the etymology of the word tyrant has changed. Through its exclusive use, tyrant initially was considered to be an absolute ruler. That was its original definition. And then by the 13th century, it had sort of carried on and diluted slightly. And I'll just read to you from the dictionary. Tyrant, noun, from the Latin tyrannus, lord, master, monarch. From the Greek tyrannos, lord, master, sovereign, probably from the Asia Minor language, probably Lydian. And there's a fascinating little link there to Lydian, and the Lydian woman being the purple cloth seller converted by St. Paul, which is just a fascinating little tale to take you on, but I don't necessarily think it has relevance in this. But what's extraordinary is how this colour has developed over the years, and from tyrants and this sense of being an absolute ruler, or rather the absolute ruler rather than the tyrant, because it was also the colour exclusively used in the Renaissance period for the depiction of Christ, as well as at times the Virgin Mary. And Christ is also described in Mark's Gospel as he's laden by his tormentors in purple cloth, mocking him for being the king of the Jews. But I would suggest that actually it is his position as the king of kings that affords him this royal iconography throughout art. And we're just going to watch a very quick clip, and we probably won't watch all of it because it's quite long, of the end of the coronation, which will bring us towards our conclusion. I am going to stop you there. I always feel quite a little bit emotional watching that still, because for me, it has two reactions. One, which is still an enormous sense of relief, in the best possible way. I felt the same when the Archbishop placed the crown on the King's head, this overwhelming sense of relief that we have done this the best we can. But also for me, it's this culmination and conclusion of all the things I've discussed with you this evening, and the King emerges from St. Edward's Shrine. And in the context of the coronation, I think it's fairly safe to say that the inclusion of Tyrian purple, this sort of dramatic Tyrian exit to the soundtrack of the national anthem, as we pray for God's protection over the sovereign, recalls the absolute status of Roman emperors. However, in a post-restoration in the 21st century, it would not be appropriate to consider the king to be a tyrant, nor would it be appropriate to consider him to be Christ-like either. But in fact, my reading of this colourful statement is a demonstration of how we have come to understand the place and position of the constitutional monarchy today, reflecting on the theology of modern monarchy and the sense that the king is the principal public servant to the nations to which he is called to be head of state, and the tension and the sort of dichotomy that exists between humble service and exalted authority. And it arguably seeps into every fibre of this colourful demonstration. So to conclude, the coronation of King Charles III and Queen Camilla on the 6th of May 2023 saw the 47th time in our shared history of the crowning of a sovereign. The crown is not only a beautiful object and a piece of craftsmanship, but I believe a statement of authority, tradition and heritage. And of all the items worn, St Edward's crown for me is the most important of these sibyls. It's a metonym for the office to which the king has been called to. It has a Rosetta Stone quality, as I've said before, of decoding the Christian values and the good governance that we, his people, who give him this office by public consent still, hold him to, and the weight of those promises and oaths made. The long-held tradition and symbolism continue to anchor the coronation and future coronations of what it is to be a Christian leader and what our Christian tradition and heritage means when serving a nation and its people. And also, I think what it does for us is it provides, the king in the coronation provides us with a demonstration of what it is to be a Christian leader and to be a follower of Christ and to understand those promises made. But in that, it also gives each of us a demonstration and an image of what we are called to in terms of serving our community, serving one another, and what it is to follow Christ in our everyday lives. So that's it from me. Thank you very much.